The chaplain stared at the order in disbelief. General George S. Patton wanted him to write a prayer for clear skies, not a humble request to the Almighty, not a gentle plea for divine assistance, a military directive to God himself. Colonel James O'Neill had served as Third Army's chaplain for months. He had written prayers for dying soldiers. He had written prayers before battles. He had comforted men who would never see their families again. But this request was something entirely different. Patton stood before him in full uniform, his famous scowl carved deep into his weathered face. Outside the window, snow fell in thick curtains across the Belgian countryside. The fog was so dense that O'Neill could barely see the vehicles parked 20 feet away. "Sir, it doesn't work that way," the chaplain protested carefully. "We don't command God. We ask humbly and accept his will." Patton's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "Make it work, chaplain. We have 3 days before Bastogne falls, 3 days before 10,000 American boys die in that frozen hell." He leaned forward. "Write the prayer." What happened 72 hours later became military legend. O'Neill left Patton's office with his mind spinning. The general had given impossible orders before. Everyone in Third Army knew stories about Patton demanding the impossible and somehow getting it. He had driven his tanks across France faster than any army in history. He had pivoted an entire corps 90 degrees in the middle of winter to rescue surrounded troops. But this was different. This was not about tanks or soldiers or strategy. This was about weather. And weather answered to God, not to generals. O'Neill walked through the frozen camp toward his quarters. Soldiers huddled around small fires, their breath forming clouds in the bitter cold. These men had been fighting for months without rest. They had pushed through France, through Luxembourg, into Belgium. And now they sat idle because fog and snow had blinded their army. The 101st Airborne Division was trapped in Bastogne, surrounded by German forces. Every day the weather held, more Americans died. Every day without air support meant more German tanks closing the noose. O'Neill understood Patton's desperation. He just did not understand how a prayer could change the sky. That night, O'Neill sat at his small desk with a blank piece of paper before him. A single candle provided flickering light. His fingers were numb from cold despite the gloves he wore. How does one write a prayer demanding good weather? The very concept seemed almost blasphemous. Prayer was about submission to God's will, not commanding it. Yet O'Neill also believed in a God who listened, a God who cared about the suffering of men. And right now, American soldiers were suffering. They were freezing in foxholes. They were dying without hope of rescue. They were watching the skies for aircraft that could not fly. O'Neill picked up his pen. He thought about the boys in Bastogne. He thought about their mothers waiting for letters that might never come. He thought about the German artillery pounding American positions while Allied planes sat useless on frozen runways. Then he began to write. The words came slowly at first, then faster. 6 sentences, that was all. 6 sentences, asking Almighty God to restrain the rains, the floods, and grant fair weather for battle. The next morning, O'Neill brought the prayer to Patton's headquarters. The general read it once, his lips moving slightly. Then he read it again. His expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching satisfaction. "This will do, Chaplain," Patton said. "This will do nicely." He handed the paper to his aide. "I want this printed and distributed to every soldier in Third Army. Every single one. 250,000 copies. O'Neill blinked. "Sir, that's an enormous undertaking. The printing alone will take days." "You have hours," Patton replied flatly. "And, Chaplain, I want a Christmas greeting on the back. Something to remind these men what they're fighting for." O'Neill nodded slowly. He had expected Patton to simply file the prayer away, perhaps read it at a staff meeting. Instead, the general was treating this like a military operation. Every soldier would carry this prayer. Every man in Third Army would read these 6 sentences and look toward heaven. It was either an act of profound faith or profound desperation, perhaps both. The printing presses ran through the night. Clerks and administrative staff worked in shifts, feeding paper into machines that had been designed for mimeographing orders and reports. Now they produced prayers. The small cards emerged by the thousands, each one bearing O'Neill's words on one side and Patton's Christmas message on the other. Patton's greeting was pure Patton. It spoke of courage, of duty, of crushing the enemy. It reminded soldiers that they were part of an unbeatable team. It told them that, with God's help, they would achieve victory. Some officers questioned the distribution. Was it appropriate for a military commander to issue prayers like ammunition? Was Patton overstepping some invisible boundary between church and state? Nobody raised these concerns to Patton directly. The general had made his intentions clear. The prayer would reach every soldier. Whether they believed in its power or not, they would carry it into battle. By the morning of December 22nd, the cards were moving through Third Army's supply lines alongside rations and ammunition. Patton himself spent those days in constant motion. He visited forward units. He stood in freezing observation posts watching the impenetrable fog. He cursed the weather with language that would have shocked civilians, but barely registered with his battle-hardened troops. The situation in Bastogne grew more desperate by the hour. The 101st Airborne was running low on everything: ammunition, medical supplies, food. The German forces surrounding them sensed victory approaching. They sent surrender demands to the American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. McAuliffe's response became legendary. A single word: nuts. But defiance alone could not save Bastogne. The surrounded troops needed relief. They needed Patton's tanks to break through the German lines. And Patton's tanks needed clear skies. Without air support, any relief column would be vulnerable to German aircraft and concentrated artillery. The fog was not merely an inconvenience. It was a death sentence for the men trapped in that frozen town. On the evening of December 22nd, O'Neill found himself summoned to Patton's quarters. The general was alone, standing before a window that showed nothing but gray mist. "Do you believe it will work, Chaplain?" Patton asked without turning around. O'Neill considered his answer carefully. "I believe God hears all prayers, sir. Whether he answers them as we wish is his decision, not ours." Patton turned to face him. The general's eyes held something O'Neill had rarely seen there: vulnerability, doubt, perhaps even fear. Not fear for himself. Patton had never shown fear of death, but fear for his men, fear that he would fail them. "I have done everything in my power," Patton said quietly. "My tanks are ready. My men are ready. My plan is sound. But none of it matters if this damned fog doesn't lift." He paused. "So I'm asking for help from the only commander who outranks me." O'Neill understood then. The prayer was not a gimmick. It was not publicity. Patton genuinely believed that God might intervene. That night, soldiers throughout Third Army received their prayer cards. In foxholes and tents, in vehicles and aid stations, men read O'Neill's words by flashlight and candlelight. Some prayed silently. Some prayed aloud with their squad mates. Some tucked the cards into their helmets or breast pockets without reading them. And some laughed bitterly at what they saw as Patton's latest eccentricity. But something shifted in Third Army that night. Call it faith, call it hope, call it the simple human need to believe that someone was listening. Men who had felt abandoned by luck and circumstance now held a small piece of paper that told them their general was asking God for help. If Patton, the most aggressive commander in the American Army, was turning to prayer, then perhaps the situation was serious enough to warrant divine attention. The cards did not change the weather, but they changed something in the hearts of men who would soon be asked to attack through snow and ice against a determined enemy. December 23rd dawned like every other day that week, gray, cold. The fog hung heavy over Third Army's positions. O'Neill woke early and looked out his window, expecting to see the same impenetrable mist that had plagued them for days. He saw mist. He saw gray. Then he noticed something strange. The gray was lighter than before. As he watched, patches began to appear in the overcast sky. Blue patches. The fog was lifting. Within hours, the transformation became undeniable. Clouds that had seemed permanent began to break apart. Sunlight, pale but real, touched the frozen ground for the first time in nearly a week. Meteorologists were stunned. Nothing in their forecasts had predicted this. The weather patterns over Belgium had shown no signs of clearing. Yet here it was, a window of clear sky opening over the battlefield like a gift from heaven. Whether it came from O'Neill's prayer or random atmospheric chance, no one could say with certainty. But the timing was extraordinary. The moment the skies cleared, the Allied air forces launched everything they had. Fighters and bombers that had sat idle for days roared into the air. They struck German supply lines. They attacked tank columns. They dropped ammunition and medicine to the surrounded troops in Bastogne. The psychological impact on German forces was immediate and devastating. For days, they had operated with impunity under the protective blanket of fog. Now death reigned from above. American P-47 Thunderbolts screamed down on German positions, their guns tearing through vehicles, and men with equal efficiency. German commanders, who had been confidently predicting the fall of Bastogne, suddenly found themselves under siege from the sky. Their supply lines, already stretched thin, began to collapse under constant air attack. The balance of the battle shifted in hours. What had seemed like inevitable German victory suddenly looked like potential German disaster. And through it all, Patton's tanks began to move. Patton wasted no time. The moment conditions allowed, he ordered his 4th Armored Division forward. The relief of Bastogne had been planned in detail for days. Every road, every possible German position, every contingency had been studied. Now the plan went into action. American tanks rolled through frozen villages, past burnt-out German vehicles, toward the besieged town. They met fierce resistance. The Germans understood what Patton was attempting and threw everything available into stopping him. Tank battles erupted across the snow-covered landscape. American infantry fought through fortified positions while artillery dueled in the distance. But Patton's men had momentum now. They had air support screaming overhead. And they had a general who appeared at forward positions with infuriating regularity, pushing, demanding, inspiring. "Drive like hell," Patton told his tank commanders. "Those boys in Bastogne are counting on us." They drove. On December 26th, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through German lines and entered Bastogne. The siege was over. American soldiers, who had held out for days against overwhelming odds, suddenly found themselves reinforced by Patton's tanks. The relief column brought not just firepower, but supplies, medical equipment for the wounded, ammunition for the defenders, food for men who had been surviving on frozen rations. The meeting between the relieving forces and the defenders became one of the iconic moments of the war. Exhausted paratroopers who had refused to surrender greeted tank crews who had driven through enemy territory to reach them. The Germans had come within days of taking the town. Perhaps within hours. The weather had changed their fate. Whether that change came from O'Neill's prayer or simple meteorological fortune remained a matter of debate. But for the men who lived through it, the timing seemed like something more than coincidence. The clear weather held for nearly a week. Day after day, Allied aircraft pounded German positions, while Patton's army expanded the corridor into Bastogne and pushed the enemy back. The German offensive, which had begun with such promise, turned into a desperate fighting retreat. Hitler's last gamble in the West was failing. His armies had achieved initial surprise and penetration, but without the fog to protect them, they could not sustain their advance against American air superiority. German commanders, who had assured Hitler that Bastogne would fall, were now explaining why their forces were being systematically destroyed from above. The Battle of the Bulge was far from over. Weeks of bitter fighting remained, but the critical moment had passed. Bastogne held. Patton's relief had succeeded. The German advance had been stopped and was being reversed. And through it all, soldiers carried small prayer cards in their pockets, wondering if those 6 sentences had somehow changed the course of history. Patton summoned O'Neill to his headquarters shortly after the relief of Bastogne. The chaplain expected a brief acknowledgement, perhaps a word of thanks. Instead, he found the general in an unusually reflective mood. Patton sat behind his desk, the prayer card lying before him. "Chaplain," Patton said, "you did a good job on that prayer. It worked." O'Neill shifted, uncomfortably. "Sir, I wrote the words. God decided whether to answer." Patton smiled slightly. It was not his famous aggressive grin, but something softer. Either way, the result was the same. Clear skies when we needed them. I don't believe in coincidences that convenient. He opened his desk drawer and produced a small box. Inside was a bronze star medal. "This is for you, Chaplain. You earned it." O'Neill started to protest. A medal for writing a prayer seemed somehow inappropriate, but Patton was already pinning it to his uniform. "That was a damn good prayer," the general said. "One of the best military decisions I ever made was ordering you to write it." Word of Patton's prayer spread throughout Third Army and beyond. Soldiers who had carried the cards into battle kept them as souvenirs. Some framed them after the war. Some passed them to their children and grandchildren as proof that they had been there, that they had witnessed something remarkable. The prayer became part of Patton's legend, one more story about a general who defied conventional thinking. Other commanders would never have dreamed of ordering a chaplain to write a weather prayer. Other commanders would have considered it superstitious nonsense. But Patton was not other commanders. He believed in God with the same fierce conviction he brought to everything else. He believed that faith was a weapon like any other, to be deployed when needed. And when he needed clear skies over Belgium, he had deployed faith with the same determination he deployed his tank divisions. Whether it worked through divine intervention or psychological effect on his own troops, the result was victory. O'Neill spent the rest of the war serving with Third Army. He conducted services, counseled soldiers, comforted the dying. But he was forever known as the chaplain who wrote Patton's prayer. Reporters sought him out. Fellow officers asked him about that December night when he sat down to write 6 sentences demanding good weather from God. His answers remained consistent throughout his life. He had written what he believed. He had asked God for help in a time of desperate need. Whether God had answered specifically or whether the weather had changed through natural causes, O'Neill could not say with certainty. But he had witnessed something in Patton's eyes that night, a general who commanded 200,000 men, who had led armies across continents, humbling himself before a power greater than any on earth. That image stayed with O'Neill until his death. The mighty brought low. The warriors seeking help from heaven. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended in late January. The cost had been enormous. Tens of thousands of American soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Entire units destroyed in the initial German onslaught. Towns and villages reduced to rubble. But the line had held. The German offensive had failed, and Bastogne remained in American hands, a symbol of defiance against impossible odds. Military historians would debate the factors that determined the battle's outcome for decades afterward. Leadership, logistics, terrain, troop quality, strategic decisions made by both sides. The weather change on December 23rd rarely received more than a footnote. Yet for those who were there, who had watched the fog lift and seen the aircraft fill the sky, that moment remained central to their memories. The day everything changed, the day prayers were answered, The day Patton's gamble on faith paid off in ways that weather forecasts could never have predicted. Patton himself spoke about the prayer rarely but meaningfully. In conversations with trusted staff, he made clear his belief that divine intervention had occurred. He did not claim that God favored one side over another in the war. He did not suggest that faith alone could win battles. But he believed that in moments of extremity, when human effort had reached its limits, calling upon God was not weakness, but wisdom. A good soldier will fight well regardless of weather, Patton once observed. But a great commander knows when to ask for help from sources beyond his control. It was vintage Patton, confident, unconventional, utterly serious about matters others might dismiss as superstition. He had gambled his reputation on a prayer card. He had won. And he never doubted that the winning had involved more than luck. The prayer cards survived the war in surprising numbers. Veterans kept them pressed in Bibles, stored in attics, preserved in scrapbooks. Today, original copies sell for substantial sums to collectors of military memorabilia. Museums display them alongside weapons and uniforms as artifacts of faith in wartime. The 6 sentences O'Neill wrote that December night have been reprinted countless times, studied by those curious about the intersection of religion and warfare. Some see the prayer as evidence of divine intervention in human affairs. Others see it as a fascinating psychological operation that boosted morale at a critical moment. Still others see it as coincidence elevated to legend by soldiers desperate to find meaning in chaos. Perhaps it was all three. Perhaps it was something beyond any of those explanations. What remains undeniable is this. A general ordered a prayer. A chaplain wrote it. The weather changed, and a battle was won. Everything else is interpretation. O'Neill lived many years after the war. He returned to civilian ministry, served communities, raised a family. But he never escaped the December of 1944. People asked him until the end of his days about Patton, about the prayer, about what he truly believed had happened over Belgium. His answer never wavered. I wrote 6 sentences asking God for good weather. 3 days later, the skies cleared. I cannot prove that God answered our prayer, but I cannot prove that he didn't. All I know is that I was there, that I wrote those words with frozen fingers in a frozen camp, and that something extraordinary happened afterward. He would pause then, as if seeing those days again. The fog, the desperation, the general who demanded a prayer like he demanded ammunition, and the morning when the gray finally broke and sunlight touched the battlefield. Was it a miracle? O'Neill would say. I spent my whole life wondering. I suppose I'll find out when I meet the one who controls the weather. Patton asked for a prayer. A chaplain wrote 6 sentences. 3 days later, the impossible happened. Coincidence or miracle? After 80 years, no one can say for certain. But here's what we know. Those prayer cards traveled in soldiers' pockets through some of the worst fighting of World War II. Men who survived Bastogne kept them for the rest of their lives. What do you think happened over Belgium that December? Was it faith, luck, or something we'll never understand? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.